It was the dead of winter, the kind that makes the world go silent under a blanket of snow and ice, when David, a reclusive man in his early 50s living alone in a remote log cabin deep in the Alaskan wilderness, first heard the noise. An odd combination of scratching, low growling, and whimpering coming from just outside his thick wooden door. At first, he thought it must have been the wind playing tricks on his ears. But when the sound persisted and grew more urgent, he grabbed his flashlight and cautiously peered through the frost-covered window. What he saw made his heart skip a beat. 2 large wolves, their fur crusted with snow and ice, eyes glowing with a strange intensity in the beam of his flashlight, were staring directly at the door. They weren't snarling or baring their teeth like predators. Instead, they looked gaunt, exhausted, and, most shockingly of all, desperate. It was a look he recognized from his time as a wilderness ranger years ago, a plea for help. He didn't know if wolves could beg, but these 2 seemed to be doing exactly that. Against every instinct telling him to keep the door closed, he slowly unlatched it, cracking it open just enough to see what they would do. The wolves didn't lunge or attack. They backed up, one of them limping slightly, its paw stained with a trace of red, and looked back at him, as if urging him to follow. He stood frozen for a moment, torn between fear and fascination, but something deeper, maybe instinct or fate, pushed him to grab his heavy parka, boots, and rifle, just in case, and step outside into the freezing night. The wolves turned immediately and began trotting through the snow-covered trees, looking back every few feet to make sure he was following. David trudged behind them through the blizzard, the wind biting his skin like razors and snow crunching beneath his boots, his breath coming out in clouds as they led him deeper into the forest, far beyond the paths he usually traveled. Nearly an hour passed, the cold making his fingers numb, when they finally stopped near the base of a large fallen pine tree, partially buried in snow. One of the wolves whined and pawed at the snow near the tree's roots, revealing what looked like a small cave or den, hastily dug out and partially sheltered by broken branches. David knelt down and shone his flashlight inside, and what he saw chilled him more than the winter air ever could. There, curled into a fetal position and barely conscious, was a woman, her face pale and lips blue, clutching something to her chest. At first, he thought it was a bundle of cloth, but as he got closer, he realized it was 3 tiny wolf pups, all huddled against her for warmth. She had clearly been out there for days, surviving only because the wolves had somehow kept her alive, maybe even sharing their own warmth. The woman's eyes fluttered open briefly, just long enough to see him and whisper a single word, "Help," before she lost consciousness again. David didn't waste a second. He wrapped her in his coat, carefully placed the pups in the inner folds to keep them warm, and carried her all the way back to his cabin, with the 2 adult wolves following silently behind, keeping pace like silent guardians. Once inside, he lit the fire, wrapped her in blankets, and did everything he could to bring her temperature back up, checking for injuries and administering basic first aid from the emergency kit he always kept on hand. All the while, the wolves waited just outside, not making a sound. Hours passed before she stirred again, and this time, her eyes stayed open long enough for him to get her name. Dr. Elena Gray, a wildlife biologist who had gone missing nearly a week earlier while tracking a pack of wolves for a research project.
The rescue team arrived the next morning after he managed to radio for help, and they were stunned to find her alive. Impossible, they said. She should have frozen to death days ago. But David knew the truth, and so did Elena. As the paramedics worked on her, she reached out and grabbed his hand, whispering, "They saved me." He looked out the window and saw the two wolves standing at the edge of the trees, watching her one last time before vanishing into the wilderness without a sound. After that night, David never saw them again, but strange things started happening every winter. Paw prints would appear on his porch, even when no other tracks were visible in the snow. Sometimes, he'd find small, carved tokens, pieces of antler or wood, left near his doorstep, almost like offerings or messages. Once, during a particularly bad storm, he woke up to find a fresh rabbit carcass left neatly on his stoop, as if returned favor for favor. And every year on the anniversary of that night, David would light a lantern and place it on his porch, not just as a tribute, but as a sign of trust and connection between two worlds that had briefly, miraculously, understood one another. In the end, the man who lived alone in the forest was never truly alone again, not since the frozen wolves begged him to follow them into the woods, and he answered a call that changed everything.